So in the last two talks, we covered in depth about the jhanas, the Buddhist system of the jhanas, the meditative system, and the mental, with a map of practice. Um, and we covered in depth about the various aspects and experience of the jhanas. And what's the point of the jhanas? The point of the jhanas is to refine our ability of observation. The point of this jhana is to practice our ability to discern the various aspects of our sensory experience. We take for granted that there is a interior part of what we think or who we think we are. And this experience is the lens through which we experience the world. And we experience the world on the outside, or so we think. So what we don't realize is this interior experience construct everything we experience, or we thought to be experiencing from the outside. And so our suffering, our experience, our sensory experience are all coming from this internal mechanism of work that goes on inside of us. And the jhanic practice is to gradually give us the ability to observe further and more refined the various lens of experiences that we perceive the world through. Except that no matter what states or jhanic experience you experience, you could be adept at holding a jhana for days, which I've done on a number of times. And so what? It eventually ends. Because no matter how pleasant it is, no matter how nice it is, and I have to say, I used to, growing up and practicing Zen, I started practicing Zen and got interested in Buddhism very early. And in Asia, there is this romanticism that comes with, we romanticize, and I think in various aspects in the West as well, we romanticize, the yogis, the adept meditators that go into the mountains and, stay there for 20 years or 30 years or whatever, and become spiritually adepts, masters of these, studying these mechanics. And as a kid, I was very fortunate because my mom took me to central Vietnam, where there's the highlands and lots of mountains, and very pleasant weather. It's like kind of like something in between summer and fall here. So a lot of Buddhist yogis prefer to stay there because the weather is so nice and you got the mountains, and so she took me as a kid to visit those places, and I looked at those. There was these small temples on the side, or even sometimes on the cliffs of mountains, on the side of the cliff, and they're beautiful. It's quiet, and I looked at one of those. We visit several, and I looked at one of those, and I thought, as a kid, this is a great place for meditative practice. I could come back here someday. I did end up coming back there in 2014 and 2016, and stayed quite a bit in those mountains. I've met quite a number of, I made a Dharma friend there who, he doesn't meditate very much himself, but he loves hanging out with yogis. So he drove me around, to visit all these yogis that adapt that he's come to know. Some are very intellectual, others are are wholly about the meditative practice, going to from all various traditions. The Zen tradition, the cross between the Zen and the Theravadan tradition, and the pure Theravadan tradition that from Burma or from Thailand. Because over the last 20 years, a lot of Vietnamese Buddhism has sent all the monks out to study from different places and come back and become quite adept at various practices. But what I've noticed about these yogis is that, and very clearly, what I've noticed is that they're very attached to the jhanic states. They're very attached to the various states that they can generate in their own, in themselves. And even those who stayed in the mountains for 20 years, which I met one, and he says to me, he says, when I was in the mountains for 20 years, he came down, when I met him, he came down only 3 years and started to receive students and take on monastic students. And he said to me one day as we were sitting drinking tea, and he says, when I was in the mountains, things were simple. And when I came down, the old karma started to arise again. The seeds is still there. I have no problem with them, but I've been I'm up there for 20 years. And this guy wasn't someone who's new to the practice. He was a wandering monk for many, many, many years, who didn't really have a place to live, and he wandered from town to cities, lived in the bush. He was your classic sort of mendicant wandering monks practice until the government forced him to stay still and won't allow him to beg anymore. So he chose to stay in that mountain for 20 years. Anyway, this is an example, and I'm not saying this to any way diminish the practice of these great adapter yogis, but this is an example of, what we don't want to do in society. Because obviously most of us is not going to have the time to go to the mountains for 20 years to practice. And it's not applicable to most of us. It's not even possible for a vast majority of us. So how does it work? Well, first we have to remember that the Buddha was a very adept yogi. He practiced these jhanic states for 6 years. And still he saw that whatever he was looking for was not available. He practiced the 8 jhanas to become so adept that his teachers said, you stay and you teach with me. You be my, successor. And he says, no, that's not what I'm looking for. Because he realized very quickly that these jhanic states, no matter how beautiful it is, no matter how blissful it is, of course, if you're attached to the bliss, the first 4 jhanic states can be very, very attractive. Right? It's one of those points where nobody needs to motivate you to sit anymore. You just love sitting. And so you have to remember, the Buddha was an adept yogi at all these jhanic states, and all this, the ability to manipulate the various states of sensory perception. And he wasn't happy with that. Why? Because these jhanic states in itself, all states, are transitory. You remember the 3 tenets of Buddhism: all is suffering, all is impermanence, and there's, which one is it? The last one, most important? There's no self. And some people like to be a little more politically correct, and they call it the non-self. Well, I like the word no self. It's kind of blunt. So how did the Buddha come to the realization of the end of suffering? Well, first of all, the Buddha experienced what you call the permanent shift in fundamental perception of the self. And what he experienced was probably sudden, and for some of us it could be gradual, but what he experienced under the Bodhi tree was sudden. The relationship, the changes in the phenomenon of self, suddenly you are no longer perceiving yourself as I am this or that, and this feeling, this mental talk, this mental image, all these perceptions that come and go. And when you become a depth yogi at all these jhanic practices, you can see all the various shifting states that comes and goes. There are states that comes and goes without actually the stirring of emotions, and then there are states that comes like a tidal wave with the stirring of emotions or something triggered of emotional state. And these are very, very coarse states. Or you can have the sea with a very calm sea with a little bit of breeze, and kind of tinkering in waves, on ripples on the surface of being. So this changes in the phenomenon itself. You realize you have a very I call it a fundamental permanent shift. If there's the work that they use, you just can't go back. You can't unsee things. and when the shift happens, all the beliefs of me as this or me as that is fundamentally not there anymore. I mean, it's hard to unsee this realization, or actually it's impossible to unsee it. And you might have this idea of self that comes through once in a while, but it doesn't stick very long. And the more adept you are at the wisdom practice, the more you realize that things just flow by and nothing really sticks. This change in relationship, I mean, I think the Westerners has and in the West, I live in the West, and there's lots of talks about enlightenment and gradual, permanent enlightenment, or things like that. But you know what? The word enlightenment is very funny, because Eastern practices doesn't use that word. There's no such word as enlightenment in Eastern practices. I've learned the word awake, which is the word Buddha, right? And to have this permanent fundamental shift, this paradigm shift in perception of self, is to have your first awakening moment. And that could be brought on by years of gradual practice, and it just sneaks up on you. Sometimes it sneaks up on you and you don't even know, and one day you realize, oh, wait a minute, this is weird. I don't respond to things the way I do anymore. or sometimes it's a seismic shift, like sudden an awakening, and that's brought on by the koan, usually by some sort of inquiry of the koan practice in Zen. And Rinzai koan practice is specifically designed to bring this kind of shift. In other traditions, it's called as the self-inquiry practice. It's painful, so a lot of people don't like it. So the mind-body experience is no longer the same. Suddenly, before we live in this prison that is called the mind-body. We are totally swept away by all shifting, changing states. We are, how do I say that, beholden to them. So kind of, something triggers and we just be possessed by them. We behave according to them. And it usually comes with feelings and feeling tones, sensory tones, and and perceptive tones, and very loud mental talk that is connected to those feelings. And these mental talks are quite distorted sometimes. And I'm not even talking about the negative distortion. I'm not even talking about the positive distortion. For example, when you fall in love with someone, that is a distortion. Suddenly that person becomes perfect. They've got no fault, and you only see the perfection in them. You only see this beautiful, idealized image of them, and then you look into their eyes and you go, my love is so beautiful. And sometimes those mental images is something that you have been imprinted ever since the first day you met them. and and most people don't realize that it's actually a projection of their own mind. It's nothing to do with the other person. They might have some traits or some things that you give you a hint, and you draw on that, and then you kind of put on, projects outside the idealized part of them that you idealize, that is not something that is kind of missing in yourself. Yeah. Because we're looking for wholeness, right? We're looking for other people can complete us, and so these mental projections come out, and this is how you experience the world, and you attribute it to the other person being the one catalyst, or at least being the force that is causing all of this in you. So I said, oh, you made me love me, you. Well, no. You're doing it all to yourself, and the ability to recognize that is the wisdom practice. Right? And even in the pretty stuff, the happier stuff, of course, most of the time, what brings us to the spiritual practice is immense suffering. And so when you wake up and you realize that, hey, the whole world is mine, it's created by mine, my mind. It's perpetuated by my mind. It is mine. It is itself. It is mine. And in Chinese, the word mind, is the heart. And the heart not only signifies the heart, which is the feeling, the part of feeling and understanding of the human nature, but also signifies the awareness, the unchanging awareness that is a part of who we are. And so that is the source. In China, in China, when they talk about the mind in Zen, or the heart in Zen, they're talking about the source. The source of all experience. Okay? The source of all experience, which actually underlies or support all of these other states and experience, mental talk, mental projections, localized consciousness, mental image, feeling tones, all of these things, and the various states that comes and goes, including the beautiful jhanic states. And this source is the very ground which we experience the world on, except we don't even know it's there. And it's like, I give you a piece of paper that's white and I put a dot on it. And I said, well, what do you see? You're going to say, I saw a dot. Most people will not see, no, I see the blank piece of paper. Because we are used to identifying things that is in the forefront and not what is behind. So when you look at the painting, you see the front of it, whatever that's been painted on the canvas. Nobody looks at a painting, go to the Louvre and look at the canvas and go, oh, that canvas is really good. It lasted 2,000 years. Man, what quality canvas. Nobody does that. So the wisdom practice is our ability to discern all the mechanism of the self as they arise and fall. To be able to discern the pushing away, or in Buddhism we call it aversion. I call it pushing away. You know, like something, you avoid, you push away. And the mechanism of pulling, we call it desire in Buddhism. And this push and pull mechanism is, you know, when you're in a very still pond, how do you get the boat to move? Well, you push and you pull, kind of like the oars, you know, into the water, right? And so the various mechanism of the self pushes and pulls the same way in order to create this perception of a separate identity, cut off from the reality of our interconnectedness. And what are we connected with other people about? What are we all connected with? Fundamentally is nothing. Emptiness. So you want to ask me, well, what happens when you have Kensho? Well, Kensho, the stream entry, this fundamental shift in perception of self. When you experience that, the first thing you realize is, oh, whoever I thought I was the whole time, you know, for me it was up to the age 28. Yeah, wherever I thought I was, or whoever I lived with or had lived with the entire time up to the time I was 28 was an unreality. And this is why Zen talks about waking up out of a dream. Literally, I was dreaming for 28 years up to that point. And when you wake up and you realize, oh my God, all that stuff, all that suffering, all that drama, it was nothing. It's much ado about nothing. And that's why when you have a sudden shift like that, a sudden shift like that, Kensho like that. And I had a classic experience of enlightenment. I had a classic Kensho experience where I wasn't even meditating. I was just sitting on a rock enjoying the campsite and the scenery. And so that sudden shift, it just shakes your world. Yeah, it makes you realize that, oh my God, when you wake up from a dream, and you can have some really good dreams, and I have many dreams at night when I sleep. A lot of times I'm quite aware of the dreams and what's going on in there. And you wake up out of that, and you wake up and you go, oh, okay, so none of that just existed. My body was just laying there, not interact with anything. All of that is mental. It's created by mental stuff. It's nothing is essentially happening. And in the wisdom practice, that realization is the start. Okay? It's the start. It's the true start of the spiritual practice. Why? Because at this point, you can't unsee it. It becomes irreversible. Before that, I'm pretty much walking blind. I'm not saying after Kensho you don't walk blind. Yeah, because the mind-body condition still has very heavy invested conditioning that is pushed down, burned in, very, very much stuck in your unconscious. Now, the Freudian word is unconscious in the Buddhist teachings. It's called alaya, which is the storehouse consciousness, which underlies all of our experience, and the gatekeeper, which is the keeps a tap on that storehouse consciousness, and lets some out and some in, everything in but some out, just enough to create the sense of perception of, I'm this person and wandering around the world and interacting with other people. In reality, is that happening? Yes and no. Because without your ability to perceive the world, through all these sensory experience, my hand, my feet, my body, and all those signals going to your mind, you have no way of interacting, perceiving with the world. And so when you sit still in meditation and you turn all of that off, kind of, to a greater extent, reduce it a lot, you start to filter through, the various levels of experience, of sensory experience, and how the mechanism is working inside to create the experience of being in the world. Okay, and until you understand and have a deep experience of that mechanism, and I don't mean this by analysis, because why? Analysis, words is another mechanism of the self. So this ability to discern is done through the critical observation method, which, by the way, in practicing the jhanas, hopefully refined it, right? What I've also realized, that practicing the jhanas is really not that helpful if you do not have a curious mind and an inquisitive and a doubtful, attitude to things. And this is where the wisdom practice kicks in. It's really important that you constantly question. You don't take anything for granted. In the Zen practice, especially Rinzai Zen, it is about that questioning. I think my best teacher who started me on the Zen journey, believe it or not, was my high school history teacher. I had him, in grade 10, and I took all of his classes afterwards, and we constantly had to make up questions when we go through that class. He would give us an article, he gives us a portion of text in the book, he gives us an event, and then he makes us question who, what, where, when, why. The 5 really important questions. And he said, without asking the right question, you will never discover a clear answer. And so I love this guy. He was odd, but he was a fantastic teacher. Actually made me stand on his desk and look at the classroom just like Dead Poet Society. And yes, I had him for 4 years, and that's all we did in class. Constantly questioning, establishing questions, inquiry. What makes a good question? And many people don't know, but that is the most important part of the spiritual practice, because we take our reality so much for granted. We don't question. And without the question, we can't observe. What are we observing? We're sitting there and things come and go, and we're not even paying attention when they come and go, because move on. I want to get to the next part. That's the attitude of most meditators, right? Move on, I want to get to the next part. Or else, I'll just get into this, kind of nice, blissful, jhanic state, and I'll stay there for an hour or 2 or whatever, maybe 20 years, and come down the mountain and realize that, oh God, all the other stuff kicks in. Your unconscious storehouse is still around, and surprise, surprise, you still experience anger, irritation, sadness, all of those things. And you ask yourself, did I fail? Did I fail? Am I a terrible failure at my Zen practice? No. You were looking for a particular idea. You are looking for a particular destination in your mind. Your practice was geared towards a destination and an idea. That's mental stuff too. Rather than becoming a very good scientist of the mind, that you're hacking your own mind and be willing to see what's going on there, you're stuck on a particular place, a particular idea, a particular attainment. Whereas I love to always see, and this has been my guide for the whole time. I'm very grateful for it because I just told my friend last night. I said, practicing Zen has a lot of good psychological benefits. Because you hack yourself, you hack the unconscious stuff. You let go of a lot of karma. You burn through karmic conditioning like nothing else. And when you do it, you get to the higher jhanas. You have to literally do that, right? Because the Zen practice, especially after Kensho, it's a path of purification. You're going to purify through the previous conditioning. You're going to burn through it, and this burn actually is very painful. But after a while, you develop this taste for the burn instead of the blissful stuff. I talked to my friend and I said, Zen has a lot of psychological benefits because you burn through all of this negative stuff, right? And when you burn through all of this negative stuff, you find, I'm not so much a depressed person anymore. I'm not an easily irritable, angry person anymore. I'm not so much bored anymore. I mean, those are great psychological benefits, right? But that's not what the point of Zen is. The point of Zen is the end of suffering. What is the end of suffering? Well, you have to be able to define what is suffering first in order to understand what the end of suffering is. And for most of us, the first 5 or 10 years into our practice, we don't even have a very good definition of it because we haven't even seen enough in ourselves to realize what is suffering. At first, we thought, oh, depression is suffering, anxiety is suffering, worry is suffering, anger is suffering. Pain, emotional pain, searing emotional pain is suffering. Anguish, panic attacks, all of those things are suffering. Really? There are various degrees of suffering. And when I Kensho, I realized the normal state that I lived in for the last 28 years was suffering. That's pretty seismic shift. Huh? So what do you do with that kind of understanding? Well, like me, I went right back to my business, which I just started at that point, and forgot about the whole thing for a year. And this is our humanness, our normal humanness experience, right? We get some wisdom, and we're like, that's not practical. Let's go back to the practical stuff. But what is really practical? What really is practical is this ability to traverse and experience life in a flexible and unfixed state. Well, it's not a state. And I don't know how to reiterate this so many times. I hate to use the word enlightenment because it's pretty loaded. But freedom is not a state. It is the ability to be unfixated on any state, whether it is the rising or falling. Its momentariness is celebrated, accepted, and then, oh, the moment's passed. So, if you ask anyone, what does the end of suffering looks like? Well, for many of us, especially with a long history of practice, the funny thing is, when we started, we thought we know, and now 30 years later, what does the end of enlightenment, the end of suffering looks like? I'm telling you, I don't know. Because I don't care anymore. And not just that. We have an idea what suffering is when we get fixated on those states, on those ideas of what suffering is, and we get attached to it, and then we build an aversion to anything that arises, and we build, a liking to the good stuff that arises. We still pick and chooses all these experiences, whereas all experience in themselves is precious. It's the flexible and unfixatedness of the identity that allows us to freely move through the world and not be bothered with things that pass by. There I go again. Did I blabber on too much? Anyone has any questions? Oh yes, and the wisdom practice. By the way, the wisdom practice is at first, you gotta kind of like what I call Kensho or Theravada practice calls the stream entry. Right, let me tell you, whether it's through effort or through sudden enlightenment, don't use the word enlightenment, through sudden awakening, it's a freebie. You get a freebie the first time. And afterwards, it requires an immense amount of effort to uncover the hidden wisdom behind that experience and to come back to be able to experience the world again through that lens. And in order to do that, you have to be willing to burn through all of the ideas that you have about life, about other people, about who you are, about what makes up who you are or who you think you are, about the habits that you have. And a lot of our habits are very telling about how we define ourselves unconsciously, or whether consciously or unconsciously, how we define ourselves. And so the wisdom practice is the practice of constantly looking at our sensory experience, or at our perceptive experience, at all of our experience as they arise and fall, right? with a space. I call it a space in between it, so that we can observe it and not be it. Huh? And at this point, you get very curious with the burn, the negative experiences. And you have to remember something. The Buddha promised the end of suffering. He didn't promise the end of pain. That's two different things. So in the Rinzai Zen practice, actually, we're crazy. We're kind of in love with the pain. Why? Because whenever we deal with physical pain in our sitting, right, we just deal with it. We kind of build up a tolerance to it. We sit long hours in sessions. Then we have a different relationship with the physical pain. Suddenly it's us over here, and there's pain over there, and the pain's okay. Huh. We still feel painful, but suddenly our relationship with it changed. And then next, what happens is what? Psychological pain. Huh? As a beginner practitioner, what we do is we constantly run away from it. That is the very reason we started our Zen practice. We want to run away from this stuff. Huh? We come to the spiritual practice to try to solve this problem of not having to deal with this physical pain. We want to transverse it. This emotional pain, we want to, I call it, there's a term for it, spiritual bypassing. And then after a while, you realize in your practice that, wow, leaning into that pain is actually where the practice is. Right? It's feeling the burn. And literally, at times, emotional pain can arise that, it comes from your gut or it comes from your tummy and very uncomfortable feelings. And it, you look at it, you sit with it, you feel the anguish. You let this just happen. It just, it dissipates and you feel the actual burn running through your body. And you literally feel the burn. It's pretty warm. And in mystical practice in Buddhism, for adept yogis, we call this tummo fire. You didn't know what that was for. Tummo fire's purpose is used to, tummo fire is the burn. We burn through all the conceptual reality associated with that feeling tone, that sensation, that conditioning that arises in ourselves. And you notice that those conditionings would have not just a feeling tone, but it would have a perception that comes with it, and the mental talk that comes with it, and sometimes mental images, right? And they could be either pleasant or unpleasant. But the burn is the real practice in the wisdom practice. Why? Because once you burn through that perception, you got a shift, another shift. And you know what? The shift in Kensho or stream entry is the biggest shift. But then, afterwards, you burn through a lot of these conditioning. There's shifts that happens constantly. Right? They're incremental shifts that burn through all your ideas. So I call the Rinzai Zen practice a deconstructive practice. After 30 years of practicing Zen, well, what did I get? Nothing. I've attained nothing. What did I lost? Oh, well, let me tell you what I lost. Well, I've lost depression. I've lost anxiety. I've lost the ability to think badly of other people and have ill will. I've lost the religiosity of Buddhism. I've lost all the religiosity beliefs of Buddhism. I've lost all attachment to rites and rituals. I've lost attachment to even the pleasant stuff. That happens through life. Even attachment. I've lost a major attachment to sensory kind of pleasurable experience. I used to be very much a pleasure seeker, sensor. I love traveling. I love trying out extreme things. And as a young person, everyone loves doing that. You jump out of the plane, skydiving, you go bungee jumping, I was one of those kids. Because why? Those experience, kind of stimulate the senses and give you this exhilaration. And after you practice the jhanas for a while, you don't care about it anymore. What you realize is those states are they're not in itself very enjoyable. It's not that I don't still experience them. I still do. Just you kind of lose the attachment to them, or the ability to for it to draw you, towards the must have. So then There's very few must-haves after you practice Zen for a while. You still have preferences, but if they don't happen, whatever. The conditions don't come for them to be, then it's fine. Boredom was something that I rarely experience these days. Loneliness, I don't even really remember what it's like. That's like for quite a while. Um, Irritation, anger, it's still around. We live in a crazy society and push our bodies too much. That's gonna happen. But you see, what is the tool for doing all this? Huh? Why do we need to break down ourselves? Why? Why do we need to understand the inner mechanism of our experience of the world? And I don't mean, you go study psychology and get a PhD. I mean, that's all conceptual stuff. We're interested in experience, being the scientists of our own reality. And there's tools to do it. What is that tool? Well, after Kensho, something arises. It's called Prajñā. And if you can't bring stillness, so you're not at that, but at the meditative practice of the jhanas, you cannot become aware of Prajñā. Prajñā is an intuitive wisdom. It is the silent voice of your Buddha nature. Right? So, you can use the word awareness. There's many words for it, but words don't really, it's not the same thing. In the stillness, you're able to access Prajñā more and more often. And if you break the mental perception, the mental filters of the mind, using a cone study method, and in Rinzai Zen, we have a couple of cone books, classical cone books that use that. I also like to use interactive cone, for the students. Whatever they're stuck at, we use that cone to cut, that perception, cut that experience, that lens that we use to filter the world. So in Buddhism, we have the Bodhisattva of Manjari who holds a flaming sword. Right? That guy is Prajñā. He is a representation of the tool of wisdom used to cut away the filters that makes up your reality, that is ignorance. Right? Because we have many layers of these filters. An unpracticed person probably so thick that you can't see anything we're through. So Prajñā, I can't even describe it. It can only be experienced. Well, actually, another person described it really well. I think Father Anthony de Mello, who also practiced Zen, and he calls it silence is the language that God speaks, and everything else is bad translation. And that's Prajñā. So before, the quality of stillness before Kensho is different, and the quality of stillness after Kensho, the experience of stillness after Kensho is different. It's vastly different. Why? Because you're seeing a mechanism there that, you realize it. I wouldn't say see, because you can't see this stuff. You realize a mechanism there that you didn't know before. It's called the watcher, one who experiences all things, accepts all things, is in the background, that is the basis of all our experience. And in Buddhism, in Zen, we call it the no self. But it also has another name. It's called the true self, the Buddha nature. So why do we have so many different language for it? Depends on where you're coming from and how you define it. We can define a pot in so many different ways. But the truth is, it's all pointing to the same thing. And this part of who we really are, well, it's really undefinable. You can only experience it. And you can't even describe the characteristics of it because it's not perceivable. It is the ground where all perceptions are supported. So it's actually who you are, who you really are. And it's available to all of us at any time, except that we are so covered by all of these conditionings and mental filters of ignorance that we're unable to see it. And when prajna arises, the way you move through the world change. Matter of fact, relationship with the world change, and how you perceive the world greatly changes. It's very hard to describe this part. I would need to say you gotta have the taste of it. And no, you don't need 30 years because I spent the first 13 years of my life in this academia books. Reading this stuff like this and thinking, I could do this stuff, right? The Vishu Dharma, this is the path of purification, is probably the hands down most comprehensive, authoritative handbook of meditation experience. You can generate so many states out of practicing everything that's written in here. I call it a medical book, written for different types of ailments, mental ailments, and use this to purify it. But see, that didn't help me. It didn't get me anywhere. Why? Because of all these ideas about life instead of just experience life. And when you get into an advanced meditator, maybe 10 years works. It works. 10-year works if you're really motivated and dedicated and sits every day and constantly inquire. You get to a point where you see sankhara, the rising of, how do I say it, form, very subtle form of, I call it intention. Right? It's not even the push and pull. Before it becomes negative or positive, there's the rising of the intention. Okay? And if you can see that, you can catch it before it rises. When you catch it before it rises, it's like a little kid. You look down on it, and it just goes, oh, okay, I won't do that again. It falls. And if you do that often enough, after a while, the pond just kind of stilts. And then all the experience in life becomes this full, empty experience. Okay, so I think I blabber on too much. We have a little time for questions. If you want to talk, just unmute yourself. Oh, somebody asked me for the name of the book. No, I'm not going to give you the name of the book. Why? Because you're going to waste 13 years of your life like me. And by the way, I got a really early start. My first time sitting down to meditate was I was 10 years old. First thing I realized when I meditated for the first time was, oh, my mind was torturing me. It's pure torture. So, any questions? Comments?
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
It feels like it would take a couple lifetimes to go through the burn. I don't know what my question is there, but
How do you know that?
I don't.
Exactly. He said that there's the inquiry. That's just the idea you have in your head. We really don't know that.
Yeah. And then the other one has escaped me. Must not have been important.
There you go.
Oh yeah. I feel like I always am at a loss for like questions. How do you know what are the right questions in Zen? Like, what makes a good question? Because I feel like I could ask a million and some of them seem so insignificant. And then, yeah.
Practice. So you know which one's insignificant. You stop quite asking those. I told you, my best Zen teacher was my history teacher in high school. We practiced asking questions for 4 years.
Yeah. So you don't mind if I ask you all sorts of questions?
No. I love questions.
Okay.
Then the Rinzai Zen practice is about questions.
I feel like I can just ask a lot of wrong questions before I get a right one, but I guess that's a good thing.
That's a good thing. It's called practice, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
sharpening the sword.
Thank you.
Nobody expects you to be perfect when you start. Matter of fact, perfection is an idea. Okay, so I love it when people come to me with questions because we get to uncover their modality of where their mind goes and whether that question is helpful or unhelpful, and then refine those questions. That's why I said sometimes a koan is the one that I help you find in yourself. A question that I help you find in yourself that is burning all your life. But you don't want to address it because you don't have an answer for it.
I'm curious to explore the idea of intentionless action.
Don't explore the idea. You know why? Don't explore the idea. Ask the question. Did I have intention before I start walking? Did I have intention when I grab this cup? And then observe it as you're doing it. Rather than having an idea of it, why don't you experience it?
I'm not sure I do.
And that's why you ask the question and then you observe reality to see if you do or not. Because right now you're not sure. Now, I love the don't know mind. I'm not sure mine is an open mind, right? With that mind, apply it to the observation.
It's just a curiosity. Why would anybody do anything at all in this world of samsara if they really could achieve that state of...
Now that question is unhelpful because it doesn't help your practice. Who cares about everybody else? They choose their own stuff. We can't even figure out how our internal reality works. Come on, other people. That's a futile effort. You remember when I started teaching? I told everybody, I said, the world's a crazy place. We all live in a mental institution. Um, because everyone's mental, that's why it's normal. We perceive it as normal. Help the world. Don't try to go out and save the world. Help the world by saving one person. You. Take yourself out of it. That is what you can do. Trying to change other people, futile effort. I'm just blabbering for the last 10 years. If you guys change, well, it's nice. If you don't, it's okay. I can watch you suffer. It's up to you to do it, right? We can only change ourselves. We can only observe our own reality and study on our own mind. Sorry, Joseph. I realized that every time you ask questions, I kind of, I have to cut through it and bring you back to the practice.
Well, if I may, you use yourself as an example often in your teachings.
Because it's not a conceptual thing. It's a experience, direct experience thing. I can give you a whole bunch of concepts. I can write books about it, and I can write, like if you write an academic essay, you write in a third person, you write in, what do you call it, objective writing. The truth is there anything objective in reality? When you come to the source of it, the observer is affecting the very thing that's been observed. There's no objective reality. Everything is perceived through a subjective lens, which is you. So why don't you study you first and experience? I can't talk about other people's experience, but I can certainly talk about my practice, my Zen practice. In some ways, it's a lineage of one master verifying the other. So I've been with my teacher for 30 years, over 30 years, and so that's why I talk about direct personal experience. I can give you something that is conceptual, far removed, an idea, but that's not going to help.
Could you articulate though, for example, why did you decide to become a psychologist and to go into university and abandon your former career? If there was no intention in denying that, what would make you do that?
I didn't decide to become a psychologist.
You're in that school.
I'm studying psychology, yes. Because I enjoy studying it.
Isn't that an intention in itself?
Nope. Because I could finish, and I really have no idea whether I'm going to go on to be a psychologist or not. Because tomorrow, I don't know. This pandemic might stop everything. No idea. See, that's what I meant by the flexible and unfixated ability to be in touch with the present and respond to what the present demands. Not some idea of the future. Because the future is just a mental thing. None of us can touch it. So that's why Joseph, to be able to move through life without sankhara, is a very subtle place of practice, and I don't ever think that any beginners can do it. It's like you and I is never going to start to run the Olympics. We haven't got the training. We're not going to be able to race in the Olympics if we haven't got the training. And these things are skills. Any other questions, or I'll just conclude today's talk? Okay. I'm going to end today's session with a chant, one of my favorite.
Do you want this recorded or should I stop it?
Yeah, you can stop now. And I'll share a screen for whoever that's on. I don't know, actually, I don't have.